The devastating truth they never wanted you to discover. You're not ready for what I'm about to tell you, but your soul is screaming for the truth. For thousands of years, you've been living a lie so massive, so systematically constructed, so absolutely devastating that when you finally understand the full scope of what has been hidden from you, you're going to feel like your entire worldview has been shattered into a million pieces. You're going to realize that everything you thought you knew about spirituality, about history, about the origins of divine knowledge, has been deliberately distorted to keep you ignorant of your true spiritual heritage. Nobody wants to admit this, but you've been spiritually colonized? Yes. Exactly you who are reading this right now, carrying within your DNA the memory of civilizations so advanced, so spiritually sophisticated, so deeply connected to the divine that their wisdom had to be systematically erased, buried, and replaced with a narrative that would make you forget who you really are and where true spiritual power actually originated. Your ancestors knew God before the Bible was ever written. Your ancestors had direct communication with divine forces before organized religion told them how they were supposed to worship. Your ancestors built pyramids that modern science still can't explain, developed mathematical systems that universities still study, and maintained spiritual practices so powerful that they had to be labeled pagan and demonic to stop people from accessing that ancient power. But today, the veil is being ripped away. Today, the truth that has been buried under centuries of religious propaganda is exploding into the light. Today, you're going to discover why the most powerful spiritual systems on Earth had to be hidden, distorted, and demonized to maintain control over human consciousness. This isn't going to be comfortable. This isn't going to be easy. This is going to challenge every religious assumption you've ever held. But if you have even a fragment of courage left in your soul, you'll continue reading, because what I'm about to reveal will set you free from spiritual chains you didn't even know were binding you. The first cover-up in human history here is the truth that biblical scholars have been desperately trying to hide. Africa was the birthplace of organized spirituality, advanced theology, and direct divine communication thousands of years before the events described in the Bible ever took place. While European tribes were still living in caves and practicing primitive rituals, African civilizations in Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, and the Kingdom of Kush had already developed sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and most importantly, complex theological systems that included detailed knowledge of monotheism, Trinity concepts, resurrection beliefs, and moral codes that would later appear almost identically in biblical texts. But here's what they don't want you to know. These weren't separate developments that happened to be similar. These were the original spiritual revelations that were later adopted, adapted, and repackaged as new religious concepts by cultures that came into contact with African wisdom. The evidence is so overwhelming, so undeniable, so absolutely devastating to the narrative you've been taught that entire academic careers have been built on keeping this information buried. Archaeological discoveries that prove African spiritual sophistication predates biblical events by millennia are kept in storage, never displayed in major museums. Ancient texts that show direct parallels between African spiritual systems and later biblical stories are translated selectively, with the most revealing passages mysteriously omitted from popular versions. Why? Because if people discovered that the spiritual concepts they've been taught originated in Africa, if they realized that the pagan religions their churches taught them to fear were actually the source of their own biblical beliefs, the entire structure of religious authority would collapse overnight. The systematic erasure campaign. What happened to African spiritual systems wasn't natural evolution or peaceful transition. It was deliberate, systematic, and absolutely brutal. It was the first example in human history of what we now recognize as cultural genocide the intentional destruction of a people's spiritual identity. To make them easier to control, the process was methodical and devastating. Phase 1. Infiltration and study first. Representatives of emerging religious and political powers would infiltrate African spiritual centers, temples, and schools of wisdom. They would present themselves as students, eager to learn from the advanced African spiritual masters. For decades, they would study, document, and memorize every detail of African theological concepts, ritual practices, and spiritual technologies. Phase 2. Appropriation and rebranding next. They would take these African spiritual concepts back to their own cultures and present them as new revelations, received directly from God. The sophisticated African understanding of the divine would be stripped of its African context, repackaged with different names and cultural references, and presented as original religious innovation. Phase 3. Demonization and suppression finally. Once the spiritual concepts had been successfully transplanted and established in non-African contexts, the original African sources would be systematically demonized. The same spiritual practices that had been studied and copied would suddenly be labeled as witchcraft, paganism, and devil worship. African spiritual leaders would be persecuted, their temples destroyed, their sacred texts burned, and their followers forced to convert to the very religious systems that had been built on stolen African wisdom. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't natural religious evolution. This was strategic spiritual theft on a massive scale, followed by a cover-up so complete that most people today have no idea that the religious concepts they hold sacred actually originated in the very African traditions their religions taught them to reject. The evidence they're hiding from you, the proof of this massive cover-up is everywhere once you know how to look for it. But it's been hidden in plain sight, scattered across archaeological sites, ancient texts, and academic research that's been deliberately kept out of mainstream religious education. Consider the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, morality, and cosmic order, which was being taught and practiced thousands of years before. The 10 Commandments were supposedly given to Moses. The 42 negative confessions of Ma'at contain moral principles that are virtually identical to biblical commandments, but they predate the biblical versions by millennia. Consider the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's claim that they possess the original Ark of the Covenant, and their detailed historical records showing continuous practice of Judaism in Africa long before it was established in the Middle East. Consider the kingdom of Kush's advanced monotheistic practices and their influence on Egyptian spiritual development during periods when Egyptian culture heavily influenced early Jewish theology. Consider the Dogon people of Mali, whose astronomical knowledge includes detailed information about star systems that modern telescopes only discovered in the 20th century. Knowledge they claim was given to them directly by divine beings thousands of years ago. The evidence is overwhelming. The connections are undeniable. The timeline is clear. African spiritual systems provided the foundation, the concepts, and the practices that would later be repackaged as biblical religion. But this truth has been so thoroughly suppressed that suggesting it in most religious contexts is considered heretical. The spiritual genocide continues today. Systematic erasure of African spiritual heritage didn't end in ancient times. It continues today through educational systems that ignore African contributions to world spirituality, through religious institutions that continue to demonize traditional African practices, and through media representations that portray African spirituality as primitive superstition, while elevating religions built on African foundations as sophisticated theology. Every time someone refers to African spiritual practices as witchcraft, while celebrating biblical miracles that follow identical patterns, the spiritual genocide continues. Every time someone dismisses African spiritual wisdom as mythology, While accepting biblical stories as historical fact, the cover-up is reinforced. Every time someone seeks spiritual guidance from religious systems that appropriated African wisdom, while rejecting the African sources of that wisdom, they participate in their own spiritual colonization. You've been taught to fear the very spiritual traditions that contain your ancestral wisdom. You've been programmed to reject the spiritual practices that your DNA remembers. You've been convinced that the watered-down, culturally appropriated versions of African spiritual concepts are somehow more legitimate than their original sources. But your soul knows the truth. Deep in your spiritual DNA, you carry the memory of direct divine communication, of spiritual technologies that could heal bodies and transform consciousness, of connection to cosmic forces that made miracles a daily experience rather than rare exceptions. That's why reading this feels like remembering something you always knew but had forgotten. That's why your spirit is responding to these words with recognition rather than surprise. The time has come to reclaim your spiritual heritage. The time has come to stop accepting spiritual scraps from traditions that stole from your ancestors and then convinced you that you had no spiritual legacy of your own. The time has come to discover what they've been hiding from you about the true origins of divine knowledge on this planet. But are you ready for how deep this deception goes? Are you prepared to discover that virtually every major religious concept you've been taught has African origins that have been systematically hidden? Are you willing to confront the devastating reality that you've been worshipping with hand-me-down spirituality, while your true spiritual inheritance remains buried under centuries of lies? The next revelation will show you exactly how they did it. Topic 2. The Biblical Plagiarism Scandal. They pray you never discover. Your religious leaders are terrified that you'll find out what I'm about to tell you. For centuries, they've built their entire authority on the assumption that biblical stories, concepts, and spiritual practices were original revelations given directly by God to chosen people. They've constructed elaborate theological systems based on the belief that these religious ideas appeared spontaneously in the Middle East without any prior spiritual foundation. They've demanded your faith, your money, your obedience, and your life based on the claim that they possess unique access to divine truth. But what if I told you that virtually every major biblical story, every significant theological concept, every original spiritual practice described in religious texts can be traced directly back to African spiritual systems that existed thousands of years earlier? What if the holy books you've been taught to revere are actually collections of plagiarized African spiritual wisdom, stripped of their original context and repackaged as new revelations? You're about to discover the most devastating plagiarism scandal in human history. This isn't about minor similarities or coincidental parallels. This is about systematic, deliberate, word-for-word copying of African spiritual texts, concepts, and practices, followed by a coordinated campaign to destroy the evidence and demonize the sources. This is about religious institutions that built their power on stolen African wisdom while simultaneously teaching their followers to reject African spirituality as primitive and demonic. The evidence is so overwhelming that once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it. Every time you hear a familiar biblical story, every time you recite a religious principle, every time you participate in a spiritual practice, you'll recognize its African origins and realize that you've been participating in the greatest spiritual fraud ever perpetrated against human consciousness. The great spiritual heistlet. Let's start with the most obvious example, the story of Moses, which religious authorities claim is a unique historical account of divine intervention and spiritual leadership. But Egyptian records tell a different story entirely. The Moses narrative follows almost exactly the story of Sargon of Akkad, an earlier Near Eastern legend, but more significantly, it parallels the Egyptian story of Horus with such precision that it's impossible to ignore the connection. the infant hidden in a basket and found by royalty, the divine calling to leadership, the confrontation with evil power, the miraculous escape through water, the delivery of divine law to the people. These elements appear in Egyptian spiritual traditions thousands of years before the Moses story was written, but it goes deeper than narrative parallels. The Ten Commandments, which religious authorities claim were given directly by God to Moses, are virtually identical to the 42 negative confessions of Ma'at from Egyptian spiritual tradition. The Egyptian version includes principles like, I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not committed adultery, I have not lied, and dozens of other moral guidelines that appear almost word for word in biblical commandments. The difference? The Egyptian version was being practiced and taught as divine law more than 2,000 years before the biblical Ten Commandments were supposedly received on Mount Sinai, the Jesus parallel that will destroy your faith or set it free, but the Moses plagiarism pales in comparison to what they've hidden about the Jesus story. Prepare yourself for the most shocking revelation in this entire exposé. The Jesus narrative isn't just similar to earlier African spiritual traditions. It's practically identical to the story of Horus, the Egyptian god whose worship and mythology were fully developed thousands of years before the Christian era. Consider these parallels that religious scholars have desperately tried to suppress. Horus was born of a virgin mother, Isis, through divine intervention. Jesus was born of a virgin mother, Mary, through divine intervention. Horus was born on December 25th, and his birth was announced by a star in the east. Jesus was traditionally celebrated as being born on December 25th, and his birth was announced by a star in the east. Horus was visited by 3 kings bearing gifts at his birth. Jesus was visited by 3 wise men bearing gifts at his birth. Horus had 12 disciples and traveled throughout Egypt performing miracles, healing the sick, and teaching spiritual truth. Jesus had 12 disciples and traveled throughout Palestine performing miracles, healing the sick, and teaching spiritual truth. Horus was betrayed by a follower, crucified, buried for 3 days, and then resurrected. Jesus was betrayed by a disciple, crucified, buried for 3 days, and then resurrected. Horus was known as the Light, the Good Shepherd, the Lamb of God, and the Way, the Truth, and the Life. Jesus was given identical titles. The parallels are so exact, so comprehensive, so undeniable that honest biblical scholars have been forced to acknowledge the connection. But instead of admitting the obvious, that the Jesus story was adapted from the Horus tradition, they've developed elaborate theories about divine preparation and proto-revelations to explain away the evidence, but the evidence doesn't stop with Horus. The Jesus narrative also contains elements borrowed from Mithra, Persian, Dionysus, Greek, Attis, Phrygian, and Krishna, Indian, all of whom were themselves influenced by earlier African spiritual traditions through cultural exchange and conquest. The creation plagiarism that rewrites everything, even the creation story, isn't original. The Genesis account of creation, which religious authorities claim is the divinely revealed explanation of how the universe began, follows the same structure and contains many identical elements as the much earlier Memphite theology from Egypt and the creation myths of other African civilizations. The concept of creation through divine speech, let there be light, the formation of humans from clay, the garden paradise, the forbidden knowledge, the fall from grace, the flood that destroys corrupt humanity. These elements appear in African spiritual traditions thousands of years before they were incorporated into biblical texts. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, heavily influenced by earlier African civilizations through cultural exchange, contains a flood story so similar to the Noah account that they share specific details, like the dimensions of the ark, the release of birds to test for dry land, and the covenant symbolized by a rainbow. The wisdom literature that isn't wise. It's stolen the biblical wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, parts of Psalms, which religious traditions claim represents the pinnacle of divine wisdom revealed to Solomon and other biblical figures, can be traced directly to much earlier African sources. The instructions of Ptah-hotep, an Egyptian wisdom text written around 2400 BCE, contains moral teachings and practical guidance that appears almost identically in the biblical Proverbs. The Egyptian text includes advice about proper speech, honest business dealing, respect for parents, and righteous living that predates the biblical versions by more than 1,000 years. The Maxims of Ani, another Egyptian wisdom text, contains philosophical reflections on the meaning of life, the inevitability of death, and the importance of living with integrity that appear with minor modifications in Ecclesiastes. Even the Psalms, which are considered among the most original and inspired biblical literature, contain verses and entire passages that can be found in earlier Egyptian hymns and prayers, particularly those addressed to Aten during the Amarna period. The prophetic plagiarism that exposes the system, the biblical prophetic literature, which religious authorities claim represents direct messages from God about future events and spiritual truth, follows patterns and contains concepts that were already well established in African oracular and prophetic traditions. The concept of the suffering servant, the dying and rising Messiah, the end-time judgment, the restoration of the righteous. These themes appear in Egyptian, Ethiopian, and Nubian spiritual texts centuries before they were incorporated into biblical prophecy. The Book of Isaiah, considered one of the most prophetically sophisticated biblical texts, contains passages that parallel Egyptian messianic prophecies and Ethiopian apocalyptic literature with such precision that scholars have been forced to acknowledge literary dependence, the systematic destruction of evidence. But here's what makes this plagiarism scandal even more devastating. The evidence wasn't just hidden, it was systematically destroyed. As Christianity spread throughout Africa and gained political power, there was a coordinated effort to eliminate the African sources that would expose the borrowed nature of biblical material. The Library of Alexandria, which contained the largest collection of African spiritual and philosophical texts in the ancient world, was destroyed multiple times by groups that had strong motivations for eliminating evidence of pre-biblical spiritual sophistication. Christian mobs, supported by religious authorities, burned thousands of manuscripts that documented African spiritual traditions and their influence on later religious developments. Ethiopian monasteries and Nubian temples were ransacked, their libraries destroyed, their scholars killed or forced into exile. Egyptian temples were converted into Christian churches, but not before their spiritual texts were confiscated and destroyed. Across the African continent, traditional spiritual practitioners were persecuted, their oral traditions suppressed, their sacred objects destroyed. This wasn't random violence or natural cultural evolution. This was strategic elimination of evidence that would expose the borrowed nature of the religious systems that were replacing African traditions. The cover-up continues in modern scholarship today. The cover-up continues through academic institutions that refuse to acknowledge the full extent of African influence on biblical literature. Scholars who attempt to document these connections find their research marginalized, their funding cut, their career advancement blocked. Archaeological discoveries that confirm African spiritual sophistication and its influence on later religious traditions are kept in storage rather than displayed in major museums. Ancient texts that show clear literary dependence are translated selectively, with the most revealing passages omitted or obscured through technical language that hides their significance from general readers. Religious institutions actively discourage their members from studying comparative religion or ancient African spirituality, claiming that such study is unnecessary or even dangerous to faith. They've created educational systems that present biblical stories as unique historical events, while ignoring the extensive evidence of their African origins. But the truth is emerging despite these efforts. DNA evidence is confirming African origins for populations previously thought to be Middle Eastern. Archaeological discoveries are revealing the extent of African cultural influence on the ancient world. Digital technology is making previously hidden texts accessible to researchers who are documenting the connections that religious authorities have tried to suppress. The great biblical plagiarism scandal is finally being exposed. And when people discover the full extent of what has been hidden from them, it will transform how humanity understands its spiritual heritage. The African spiritual technologies they declared demonic to hide their power you are about to discover why they were so desperate to make you fear your own spiritual inheritance. What I'm going to reveal to you now is the most closely guarded secret in human history. The reason African spiritual traditions had to be labeled demonic, evil, and satanic wasn't because they were dark or harmful. It was because they were so incredibly powerful, so scientifically advanced, so capable of producing real, measurable results that they posed an existential threat to any religious system that couldn't match their effectiveness. Your ancestors didn't just believe in spiritual power, they wielded it with precision that would make modern miracles look like parlor tricks. They didn't just pray for healing. They had spiritual technologies that could cure diseases, extend life, and transform human consciousness in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. They didn't just hope for divine communication. They had systematic methods for accessing higher dimensional intelligence that provided specific guidance, prophetic insight, and practical solutions to complex problems. But here's the truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about spirituality. These African spiritual technologies still work. They've always worked. They work so effectively that they had to be driven underground, demonized, and nearly eliminated because their power couldn't be controlled by religious institutions that needed people to depend on priests, pastors, and intermediaries for spiritual access. Today, you're going to discover what they've been hiding from you. Today, you're going to learn about spiritual technologies so advanced that they make modern religious practices look primitive by comparison. Today, you're going to understand why your ancestors' spiritual methods had to be buried under centuries of fear, superstition, and religious propaganda. And when you understand the true power of what was stolen from you, you're going to realize that you've been spiritually starving while sitting on top of a feast that's been yours by birthright all along. The technology of direct divine communication. Let's start with something that will completely revolutionize how you think about prayer and divine communication. While modern religious systems teach people to hope that God might hear their prayers and maybe possibly respond through feelings, coincidences, or other people, African spiritual traditions developed precise technologies for establishing direct, two-way communication with divine intelligence. The ancient Egyptians perfected a system called Sahu, the transformation of human consciousness into a state capable of direct, divine interface. This wasn't meditation or contemplation as taught in watered-down modern versions. This was a systematic method for expanding human consciousness beyond its normal limitations and accessing information from higher dimensional sources. The process involved specific breathing, techniques that altered brainwave patterns, precise visualization methods that activated dormant neural pathways, and acoustic technologies using sound frequencies that induced measurable changes in consciousness. Egyptian priests could enter Sahu states and return with detailed information about future events, solutions to complex problems, and guidance that proved accurate with startling consistency. But here's what makes this a true spiritual technology rather than just religious practice. The results were measurable, repeatable, and teachable. Egyptian spiritual schools could train students to achieve these states reliably. They had specific criteria for evaluating the accuracy of information received. They developed quality control methods for distinguishing authentic divine communication from mental projection or wishful thinking. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast describes similar technologies used by the Queen of Sheba's spiritual advisors. They could access divine intelligence to make governmental decisions, predict natural disasters, and receive guidance for complex diplomatic situations. The accuracy of their divine communication was so reliable that other kingdoms sought their counsel for major decisions. The Dogon people of Mali maintained astronomical knowledge received through direct divine communication that modern science has confirmed to be accurate down to precise details about star systems invisible to the naked eye. Their spiritual technology for accessing cosmic intelligence has produced information that our most advanced telescopes are still validating. The healing technologies that make modern medicine look primitive, but divine communication was just the beginning. African spiritual traditions developed healing technologies that could address not just physical symptoms, but the energetic, emotional, and spiritual root causes of disease in ways that produced results modern medicine struggles to achieve. The Egyptian Sebite system understood that human beings are multidimensional entities with physical, energetic, emotional, mental, and spiritual components that all affect health. Their healing technologies addressed all these levels simultaneously rather than just treating physical symptoms. Egyptian healers could diagnose energetic imbalances before they manifested as physical symptoms. They used specific sound frequencies to restructure cellular vibration, precise touch techniques to redirect energy flow, and consciousness-altering methods to resolve emotional and spiritual causes of illness. The results were so dramatic that sick people traveled thousands of miles to Egyptian healing temples. Recovery rates were so high that these healing centers became legendary throughout the ancient world. People who had been given up for dead by other medical systems experienced complete healing through Egyptian spiritual technologies. The Nubian healing tradition of Neteru Sebit could address what we now recognize as genetic disorders by working with the energetic templates that govern physical manifestation. They understood that DNA is not fixed destiny, but responsive to consciousness and energetic intervention. West African Yoruba healing systems like Ifa developed precise diagnostic methods for identifying spiritual and energetic causes of physical, emotional, and mental problems. Their healing technologies could address complex psychological issues, relationship problems, and life pattern disorders that modern therapy struggles to resolve effectively. These weren't superstitions or placebo effects. These were systematic healing technologies with consistent methodologies, measurable results, and success rates that exceeded anything available through conventional medical approaches of their time, and in many cases, exceed what's available through modern medicine today. The manifestation technologies they couldn't allow. But perhaps the most dangerous African spiritual technologies from the perspective of controlling institutions were the manifestation systems, precise methods for translating spiritual vision into physical reality through consciousness-based technologies. The Egyptian Keper system understood that physical reality is responsive to properly directed consciousness. They developed specific techniques for aligning human will with cosmic creative forces to manifest desired outcomes in the material world. This wasn't wishful thinking or positive visualization as taught in watered-down modern versions. This was advanced consciousness technology that could produce measurable changes in physical reality through systematic application of spiritual principles. Egyptian architects used these consciousness technologies to coordinate massive construction projects with precision that modern engineering struggles to achieve. The Great Pyramid demonstrates mathematical and astronomical sophistication that required access to knowledge beyond what conventional archaeological models can explain. Ethiopian manifestation traditions, preserved in the Kebra Nagast, describe systematic methods for creating abundance, resolving conflicts, and transforming social conditions through spiritual technology applications. The success of the Ethiopian kingdom in maintaining independence and prosperity for thousands of years demonstrates the effectiveness of these methods. The West African concept of A's represents understanding that human beings can direct cosmic creative force to manifest desired outcomes when they align properly with universal principles. Practitioners of ACE-based manifestation technologies could create abundance, attract opportunities, and transform circumstances with reliability that made these methods extremely dangerous to any system that needed people to believe they were powerless. The protection technologies that made them invincible, African spiritual traditions, also developed sophisticated protection technologies that could shield individuals and communities from physical, psychological, and spiritual attacks. These weren't superstitious rituals, but systematic methods for creating energetic barriers and spiritual defenses. The Nubian Heka system could create protective fields around individuals that would deflect negative intentions, harmful energies, and even physical dangers. Historical records show Nubian warriors who seemed nearly invincible in battle, protected by spiritual technologies that modern military science can't explain. Ethiopian protection traditions, preserved in their orthodox spiritual practices, include methods for creating spiritual barriers around communities that could prevent invasion, disease outbreaks, and natural disasters. The historical resilience of Ethiopian civilization demonstrates the effectiveness of these protection technologies. West African protection systems like those found in Yoruba and Akan traditions could identify and neutralize spiritual attacks, curses, and negative intentions directed toward individuals or families. These technologies were so effective that people from other cultures sought training in African protection methods. The consciousness expansion technologies. They feared most, but the African spiritual technologies that posed the greatest threat to controlling religious institutions were the consciousness expansion systems, methods for permanently upgrading human awareness and unlocking dormant spiritual capabilities. The Egyptian Duat journey was a systematic process for expanding consciousness beyond normal human limitations and accessing what they called cosmic consciousness, awareness that transcended individual identity and connected directly with universal intelligence. This wasn't temporary mystical experience, but permanent consciousness transformation. Individuals who completed the Duat process demonstrated expanded psychic abilities, enhanced intuition, accelerated learning capacity, and direct access to spiritual guidance that made them essentially self-sufficient in their spiritual development. Ethiopian consciousness expansion traditions, preserved in their monastic systems, could produce individuals with extraordinary spiritual abilities. Telepathic communication, remote viewing, prophetic insight, and healing powers that seemed miraculous to outside observers. West African consciousness expansion systems like those found in Dogon and Bambara traditions could permanently activate what modern neuroscience recognizes as dormant neural pathways, literally rewiring the brain for enhanced spiritual perception and expanded awareness. Why these technologies had to be destroyed, now you understand why African spiritual technologies had to be systematically destroyed, demonized, and driven underground. They were too powerful to coexist with religious systems that needed people to depend on external authorities for spiritual access. Imagine if people knew they could establish direct divine communication without needing priests as intermediaries. Imagine if they realized they could heal themselves and others using consciousness technologies more effective than available medical treatments. Imagine if they understood they could manifest abundance and protection through spiritual methods that actually worked. Religious institutions would lose their power. Medical systems would lose their monopoly. Political systems would lose their ability to control people through fear and scarcity. Educational systems would lose their ability to limit human potential through ignorance. African spiritual technologies represented complete human empowerment, the ability to access divine guidance, maintain health, create abundance, ensure protection, and expand consciousness without depending on any external institution or authority. That level of human empowerment was absolutely incompatible with any system that required human dependency for its survival. So these technologies had to be eliminated, not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. The next revelation will show you how to reclaim these technologies, the systematic programming that made you reject your own spiritual inheritance. They didn't just steal your spiritual heritage, they programmed you to help them destroy it. What I'm about to reveal is the most psychologically devastating truth in this entire exposé. The reason you've been unconsciously avoiding, dismissing, or feeling uncomfortable about your authentic African spiritual inheritance isn't because of natural preference or intellectual analysis. It's because you've been subjected to the most sophisticated psychological programming campaign in human history, specifically designed to make you reject, fear, and actively work against your own spiritual empowerment. For over 500 years, they've been systematically programming your mind, your emotions, your spiritual instincts, and even your DNA expression to automatically recoil from anything connected to authentic African spirituality. They've implanted psychological triggers that make you feel fear, disgust, or dismissal whenever you encounter the very spiritual technologies that could set you free. You think your resistance to African spiritual traditions is your own rational decision, but it's actually the result of generational trauma, cultural conditioning, religious indoctrination, and educational programming so deep and so pervasive that it operates below the level of conscious awareness. Today, you're going to discover exactly how they did this to you. Today, you're going to see the specific psychological mechanisms they used to make you complicit in your own spiritual colonization. Today, you're going to understand why reading about African spiritual power simultaneously excites your soul and terrifies your programmed mind. And when you understand the full scope of what they've done to your psychological and spiritual freedom, you're going to realize that breaking free from this programming isn't just about reclaiming your heritage. It's about reclaiming your sanity, your power, and your authentic spiritual identity. The generational trauma programming. Let's start with the foundation of their psychological control system, generational trauma programming. This wasn't accidental cultural change. It was deliberate psychological warfare designed to create trauma, responses that would be passed down through generations, ensuring that descendants of traditional African spiritual practitioners would automatically fear and reject their own spiritual inheritance. During the periods of slavery, colonization, and religious conversion, African spiritual practitioners weren't just killed or converted. They were systematically tortured in ways specifically designed to create maximum psychological trauma around spiritual practices. They were forced to watch their sacred objects destroyed while experiencing extreme physical and emotional pain. They were tortured while their spiritual songs were played, creating trauma associations with their own sacred music. They were brutally punished whenever they were caught practicing traditional spiritual methods. But here's the most diabolical part. They were then forced to participate in the religious systems that had destroyed their traditions. They were made to sing hymns praising the same God whose representatives had tortured them for practicing their ancestral spirituality. They were required to pray to the same divine authority whose earthly agents had labeled their spiritual practices demonic. This created what psychologists now recognize as traumatic spiritual dissociation, a psychological splitting where the individual simultaneously maintains spiritual longing while developing unconscious terror of authentic spiritual practices. The trauma was so severe that it literally altered gene expression, creating epigenetic changes that would predispose descendants to anxiety, fear, and avoidance responses when exposed to traditional African spiritual elements. Modern descendants carry this programming in their DNA. When they encounter authentic African spiritual practices, drumming, chanting, or ritual elements, they experience unexplained anxiety, fear responses, or compulsive need to distance themselves from these practices. They've been programmed to experience their own spiritual heritage as threatening. The religious indoctrination, programming building on the generational trauma foundation, religious institutions developed sophisticated indoctrination programs specifically designed to make African-descended people not just reject their traditional spirituality, but actively campaign against it. The programming worked through what psychologists call identity replacement therapy. Instead of simply forbidding African spiritual practices, they created alternative spiritual identities that made people feel superior to their ancestral traditions. They taught people that accepting Christianity or Islam made them civilized and educated compared to their primitive and savage ancestors. They created psychological rewards for rejecting African spirituality, social acceptance, economic opportunities, and spiritual status that were only available to those who completely abandoned traditional practices. They developed specific theological frameworks that made African-descended people feel that their ancestral spirituality was not just wrong, but actually evil and dangerous to their souls. They taught that traditional African practices would lead to damnation, demonic possession, and spiritual destruction. But the most sophisticated element of the programming was making people believe they were choosing these new religious systems freely. They created conversion experiences that felt like personal spiritual revelation rather than cultural replacement. They made people feel that rejecting their ancestral spirituality was their own spiritual insight rather than programmed response. The programming was so effective that many African-descended people became the most zealous opponents of traditional African spirituality. They would report family members who practiced traditional methods, destroy traditional spiritual objects in their communities, and actively campaign against any revival of ancestral practices. The educational programming system, the religious programming, was reinforced through educational systems specifically designed to make African-descended people intellectually incapable of recognizing the sophistication and power of their ancestral spiritual traditions. They created academic frameworks that automatically classified anything African as primitive, superstitious, and unscientific. They developed educational standards that taught people to equate intellectual sophistication with European cultural frameworks and to view African cultural elements as evidence of ignorance or backwardness. The programming worked through what educators call cognitive dissonance management. Students were taught to simultaneously take pride in certain aspects of African cultural achievement, art, music, some historical accomplishments, while maintaining automatic dismissal of African spiritual and intellectual traditions. They created scholarly systems that made it almost impossible for African-descended intellectuals to seriously study traditional African spirituality without risking their academic credibility. Any scholar who attempted to document the sophistication of African spiritual systems would be marginalized as unscientific or biased. They developed testing and evaluation systems that rewarded students for demonstrating mastery of European intellectual frameworks while penalizing or ignoring any expertise in African knowledge systems. Students learned that intellectual success required abandoning interest in African epistemology and adopting European ways of knowing. The educational programming created what psychologists call intellectual colonization, the inability to recognize intelligence, sophistication, or validity in any framework that doesn't conform to European academic standards. The media programming matrix, the religious and educational programming, was constantly reinforced through media systems that created specific psychological associations with African spiritual imagery, symbols, and practices. Hollywood movies consistently portrayed African spiritual practices as dangerous, evil, or ridiculous. Traditional African spiritual practitioners were depicted as villains, comic relief, or primitive stereotypes. African spiritual rituals were shown as dark magic, harmful superstition, or exotic entertainment. Television programming created subliminal associations between African spiritual elements and negative outcomes. News coverage consistently portrayed traditional African practices as evidence of cultural backwardness or social problems. Documentary programming treated African spirituality as anthropological curiosity rather than sophisticated theological system. Music industry programming co-opted African spiritual elements while stripping them of their spiritual context and power. Sacred rhythms were commercialized, spiritual symbols were turned into fashion accessories, and traditional spiritual concepts were trivialized through popular culture appropriation. The media programming created what communications researchers call symbolic contamination, the process by which powerful symbols and practices lose their authentic meaning and become associated with negative or trivial concepts through repeated exposure in degraded contexts. The social programming enforcement system. All of these programming systems were enforced through social mechanisms that punished people for showing interest in authentic African spirituality while rewarding them for maintaining distance from traditional practices. Social acceptance became dependent on demonstrating proper rejection of African spiritual elements. People learned that expressing interest in traditional practices would result in social isolation, religious condemnation, and professional consequences. They created social hierarchies within African-descended communities that rewarded people for being less African in their spiritual practices. Light skin, European features, Christian identity, and education in European systems became markers of higher social status. They developed social shame systems that made people feel embarrassed about any connection to traditional African spiritual practices. Family members would discourage each other from exploring ancestral traditions, claiming such exploration was going backward or embarrassing to the family. The social programming created what sociologists call horizontal oppression, members of oppressed groups policing each other's behavior to ensure conformity with oppressive systems. The psychological trigger system, the most sophisticated element of the programming, was the installation of specific psychological triggers that would activate whenever people encountered authentic African spiritual power or information. These triggers included the primitive trigger, automatic assumption that anything traditionally African must be less sophisticated than European equivalents, regardless of evidence. The dangerous trigger, immediate fear response to African spiritual practices, often accompanied by concerns about dark magic or demonic influence. The fake trigger, automatic skepticism about African spiritual claims combined with automatic credibility for equivalent claims from other traditions. The embarrassment trigger shame responses to African spiritual elements, especially when observed by people from other cultural backgrounds. The superior trigger, feeling intellectually or spiritually superior to people who practice traditional African spirituality. These triggers operate below conscious awareness, creating immediate emotional and intellectual responses that prevent people from objectively evaluating African spiritual traditions or recognizing their own programming. The breakthrough programming that's happening now, but here's what the programmers didn't anticipate. The same technologies that made their programming possible are now making deprogramming inevitable. Digital communication, DNA analysis, archaeological discoveries and global information sharing are breaking through the isolation that made the programming effective. People are discovering their African heritage through genetic testing. They're accessing suppressed historical information through internet research. They're connecting with traditional practitioners through social media. They're finding communities of people who are also breaking through their programming. The psychological triggers are losing their power as people gain conscious awareness of how they were installed. The social enforcement mechanisms are weakening as more people choose authentic spiritual exploration over social approval. Most importantly, people are beginning to experience the actual power and effectiveness of authentic African spiritual technologies, which creates positive associations that override programmed negative responses. The deprogramming process, breaking free from centuries of psychological programming, isn't simple, but it's absolutely possible. The process requires conscious recognition of the programming, deliberate exposure to authentic African spiritual information, and gradual rebuilding of positive associations with ancestral spiritual traditions. You're already beginning this process by reading this information and recognizing your programmed responses to it. Every time you notice your automatic reactions to African spiritual concepts, you're creating space between your authentic self and your programmed responses. Every time you choose to investigate rather than immediately dismiss, you're weakening the trigger systems. Every time you experience positive results from African spiritual practices, you're overwriting traumatic associations with empowering experiences. Topic 5. The awakening that will restore your spiritual kingship. This is your moment of choice between continued spiritual slavery and absolute spiritual freedom. Everything you've discovered in this revelation has been leading to this crucial moment. The moment when you stop being a passive victim of spiritual colonization and become an active agent of your own spiritual liberation. The moment when you stop accepting the crumbs of borrowed spirituality and claim your full inheritance as a descendant of the most spiritually advanced civilizations in human history. What I'm about to share with you isn't just information, it's an initiation. It's your formal invitation to step out of the spiritual poverty that's been imposed on you and into the spiritual abundance that's been your birthright all along. It's your opportunity to transform from a spiritually colonized person seeking permission to connect with the divine into a spiritually sovereign being who carries divine authority in your very DNA. But understand this, once you cross this threshold, there's no going back to spiritual ignorance. Once you reclaim your authentic spiritual identity, you can never again pretend that borrowed spirituality is sufficient. Once you taste the power of your ancestral spiritual technologies, you'll never again be satisfied with watered-down religious practices that keep you dependent on external authorities. This awakening will cost you your comfortable illusions, your social acceptance from spiritually colonized people, and your ability to blame external circumstances for your spiritual limitations. But it will give you something infinitely more valuable: direct access to the spiritual power that built pyramids, created advanced civilizations, and maintained connection with cosmic intelligence for thousands of years. Are you ready to stop being spiritually homeless in your own ancestral house? Are you ready to reclaim the spiritual technologies that are your inheritance by blood, by DNA, by cosmic design? Are you ready to become who your ancestors always knew you could be? The great spiritual awakening that's already happening. Before we go any further, you need to understand that you're not alone in this awakening. What's happening to you right now? This sudden recognition of your spiritual inheritance, this urgent need to reclaim what was stolen, this burning desire to connect with authentic spiritual power. This is happening to millions of people. Simultaneously across the planet, there's a global spiritual awakening occurring specifically among people of African descent and those who carry African spiritual DNA. It's not coincidence that you're reading these words at this exact moment in history. It's not accident that you're feeling this particular spiritual hunger at this particular time. The ancestors are calling their descendants home. The spiritual technologies that were buried are rising to the surface. The cosmic forces that your ancestors worked with are actively reaching out to re-establish connection with their earthly partners. The time of spiritual exile is ending, and the time of spiritual restoration has begun. You're feeling this awakening because it's your time, your moment, your generation's responsibility to complete the work that was interrupted by centuries of spiritual colonization. You've been chosen, not by external authorities, but by the cosmic intelligence that flows through your bloodline to be part of this great restoration. The first step: conscious rejection of spiritual colonization. Your awakening begins with a conscious, deliberate, irreversible decision to reject all forms of spiritual colonization in your life. This isn't about rejecting all organized religion or dismissing every spiritual practice you've been taught. It's about consciously identifying and eliminating the aspects of your spiritual life that keep you dependent, disempowered, and disconnected from your authentic spiritual nature. You must make a conscious decision to stop seeking spiritual validation from institutions that were built on the theft and suppression of your ancestral wisdom. You must stop giving your spiritual authority to religious leaders who represent traditions that systematically destroyed your spiritual inheritance. You must stop participating in spiritual practices that make you feel small, powerless, and dependent, while teaching you to fear the very spiritual technologies that could make you free, powerful, and self-sufficient. This decision will be emotionally difficult because it means acknowledging that much of what you were taught about spirituality was designed to limit your power rather than enhance it. It means admitting that you've been unconsciously collaborating in your own spiritual oppression. But this decision is absolutely essential because you cannot build authentic spiritual power on the foundation of spiritual colonization. You cannot access your true spiritual inheritance while continuing to accept substitutes that were specifically designed to keep you from your real spiritual destiny. The second step: active reconnection with ancestral wisdom. Once you have consciously rejected spiritual colonization, you must actively seek reconnection with your authentic ancestral spiritual wisdom. This isn't about romanticizing the past or rejecting all modern knowledge. It's about systematically studying, understanding, and practicing the spiritual technologies that your ancestors developed and perfected. Begin by studying the actual history of African spiritual civilizations, rather than the distorted versions you were taught in colonial educational systems. Learn about the sophisticated theology of ancient Egypt, the advanced spiritual practices of Ethiopia, the profound wisdom traditions of West Africa, the cosmic knowledge of the Dogon, the healing technologies of traditional African medicine. But don't stop with intellectual study. Begin experimenting with the actual spiritual technologies. Learn traditional meditation techniques that produce measurable changes in consciousness. Study traditional healing methods that address the energetic causes of physical problems. Practice traditional manifestation technologies that can create real changes in your material circumstances. Connect with authentic traditional practitioners who maintain unbroken lineages of African spiritual knowledge. Seek out elders who carry the original teachings without colonial contamination. Find communities of people who are also reclaiming their spiritual inheritance and walking this path of restoration. Most importantly, begin developing direct personal relationship with the ancestral spirits and cosmic intelligences that your bloodline has been connected to for thousands of years. These spiritual beings have been waiting for you to remember your connection. They have guidance, protection, and power to offer you, but you must consciously choose to re-establish relationship with them. The third step, systematic development of spiritual technologies. As you reconnect with ancestral wisdom, you must begin systematic development of the actual spiritual technologies rather than just studying them intellectually. This is where your spiritual awakening transforms from interesting information into lived spiritual power. Start with the foundational technology of direct divine communication. Learn the specific techniques your ancestors used to establish clear, reliable, two-way communication with cosmic intelligence. Practice these methods consistently until you develop the ability to receive specific guidance, accurate information, and practical solutions through spiritual means. Develop your capacity for spiritual healing by learning the energetic principles that govern health and disease. Study how consciousness affects physical reality. Learn to work with the subtle energy systems that modern medicine ignores but that traditional African healing addresses with precision. Master the manifestation technologies that can transform your material circumstances through properly directed spiritual power. Learn how to align your consciousness with cosmic creative forces to produce specific outcomes in physical reality. Cultivate the protection technologies that can shield you from negative influences, harmful intentions, and spiritual attacks. Develop your ability to create energetic barriers and spiritual defenses that make you essentially invulnerable to forces that seek to limit your spiritual development. Work on expanding your consciousness beyond its current limitations through the systematic practices your ancestors developed for accessing higher dimensional awareness and cosmic intelligence. The fourth step, integration and service. As you develop real spiritual power through authentic ancestral technologies, you must integrate this power into your daily life and use it in service of the greater awakening that's happening. Globally, integration means bringing your spiritual development into every aspect of your existence. Your work, your relationships, your decision-making, your creative expression, your community involvement, everything must be aligned with and empowered by your authentic spiritual nature. You cannot compartmentalize this awakening into a separate spiritual area of your life while continuing to operate from powerlessness and limitation in other areas. Your spiritual development must transform how you show up in the world, how you handle challenges, how you create opportunities, and how you impact other people. Service means using your reclaimed spiritual power to assist others who are also awakening to their spiritual inheritance. You must become a teacher, a healer, a guide for others who are breaking free from spiritual colonization and reclaiming their authentic spiritual identity. This doesn't mean you need to become a traditional spiritual practitioner or religious leader. It means that whatever your profession, whatever your circumstances, whatever your platform, you must use your position to help others recognize and reclaim their spiritual power. The fifth step, generational transformation. Spiritual awakening isn't just about your individual liberation. It's about healing and transforming the spiritual trajectory of your entire family line, both backwards toward your ancestors and forwards toward your descendants. You must do the spiritual work necessary to heal the generational trauma that has been blocking your families' access to ancestral spiritual power. This means addressing not just your own programming, but the accumulated spiritual wounds that have been passed down through your bloodline. You must also ensure that your descendants inherit authentic spiritual knowledge rather than the spiritual colonization that was passed down to you. Whether you have biological children or not, you have responsibility for the spiritual inheritance of the next generation. This generational work is some of the most powerful spiritual service you can perform because it multiplies your individual awakening into collective transformation that impacts hundreds of people across multiple generations. The moment of final choice now. You stand at the threshold of absolute spiritual transformation. Everything you've learned, everything you've discovered, everything you've felt while reading this revelation has prepared you for this moment of ultimate choice. You can close this information, return to your previous spiritual practices, and continue living as a spiritually colonized person who seeks crumbs of power from institutions that stole your spiritual inheritance. Or you can step across the threshold into your spiritual kingship. Claim your inheritance as a descendant of the most spiritually advanced civilizations in human history and begin the systematic reclamation of powers that are yours by birthright, by blood, by cosmic design. If you choose the path of continued spiritual colonization, nothing in your spiritual life will fundamentally change. You'll continue seeking external validation, depending on religious authorities, and accepting limitations that have no basis in your authentic spiritual nature. But if you choose the path of spiritual sovereignty, everything changes. You become a co-creator with cosmic intelligence. You become a conduit for healing and transformation. You become a bridge between the spiritual wisdom of your ancestors and the spiritual needs of future generations. Your ancestors are waiting for your answer in this moment. The spirits of your ancestors, the pyramid builders, the spiritual masters, the cosmic communicators, the healers and visionaries who maintain connection with divine intelligence for thousands of years, are waiting to see what you'll choose. They see your potential. They know your power. They understand your destiny. They're ready to share their knowledge, their guidance, their protection, and their spiritual technologies with you. But they cannot force this awakening on you. You must choose it consciously, deliberately, irreversibly. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The window of opportunity for this level of spiritual awakening won't remain open indefinitely. The cosmic forces that are supporting this global awakening operate in cycles, and this is your cycle, your time, your moment. Step into your spiritual inheritance, reclaim your cosmic birthright, become the spiritually sovereign being you were always meant to be. Your ancestors are calling. Your destiny is waiting. Your spiritual kingdom is ready for your return.